I suppose there are times when it's good to take a walk and not to have a particular direction or plan in mind. Wandering around with nowhere to go can be fun, but when you have a particular goal to reach, when you have a particular place to be at a certain time, it's usually better to have a map, a plan, a route to follow. This series of lessons is entitled Building Your Theology. Reaching sound conclusions when we build a theology is so important that we must have a plan for meeting that goal. So, in this series of lessons, we'll investigate some of the basic and essential directions we should follow to develop a responsible Christian theology. This first lesson is entitled, What is Theology? And our answer to this question will indicate a strategy for studying theology that has benefited the church in the past and that we should follow today. To explore this strategy, our lesson will divide into three main parts. First, we'll look at the definition of theology. Second, we'll explore the goals of theology. And third, we'll touch on the topics of theology. Let's begin by defining what we mean when we use the term theology. As we look into this topic, we'll touch on three matters. First, we'll look at some typical definitions offered by four theologians. And second, we'll describe some of the tendencies or perspectives of these definitions. And third, we'll evaluate these various tendencies. Let's turn first to some of the ways theologians have defined theology. Now, according to Romans chapter 1, there's a very important sense in which all human beings do theology all of their lives. Even unbelievers are confronted with general revelation which leads them, however unconsciously at times, to reflect on God and His just requirements in some way or another. And believers, no matter what profession they have, spend much of their time with thoughts of God. Yet, as we begin our study, we want to focus on theology as a more formal task, a task performed by people who make a concerted and well-informed effort in a particular discipline of study. There are countless ways Christians and non-Christians have defined the formal discipline of theology, but as we begin our discussion of the formal study of theology, we'll limit our focus to four highly respected Christian theologians who have provided us with some helpful orientations. Let's consider the definitions we find in the writings of Thomas Aquinas, Charles Hodge, William Ames, and the contemporary theologian John Frame. First, Thomas Aquinas, the renowned Roman Catholic theologian, represents a very traditional definition of theology. His outlooks grew out of the practices of theologians that came before him, and they continue to influence many branches of the church today. In Book 1, Chapter 1, Section 7 of his well-known Summa Theologica, Aquinas called theology sacred doctrine and defined it this way: a unified science in which all things are treated under the aspect of God, either because they are God Himself or because they refer to God. This definition usually feels quite comfortable to students of theology, and it makes a lot of sense to most of us. It has two important dimensions that deserve our special attention. First, Aquinas defined theology as a science. Now, he did not mean science in the modern sense of the term, but science in the broader sense of an intellectual or scholarly pursuit. In this sense, theology is an academic task with a rather specific goal. Aquinas' definition indicates that just as some people study biology, psychology, law, or history, there are other people who pursue theology as an academic discipline. This concept of theology is fulfilled primarily through the kinds of concerns and activities that are commonly associated with academic study. In this view, the theologian's job is primarily to think, teach, or write about theological doctrines or concepts. Now, of course, Aquinas did not believe that theology should remain an academic task. Rather, theology should influence every dimension of the Christian life. Nevertheless, his view tended to conceive of theology primarily as an intellectual pursuit. As we look at Aquinas' definition of theology, we see a second important dimension. For Aquinas, theology has at least two levels. On the one hand, theologians address issues pertaining to God Himself. For instance, we formulate opinions on matters such as the attributes of God, His omniscience, His omnipresence, His holiness. We call these subjects the study of theology proper. God Himself is the object we study. On the other hand, as Aquinas used the term, theology is also the study of any other subject that relates to God or refers to God. These topics could be discussed without particular reference to God, but theologians perform their craft by relating subjects to God. For instance, eschatology, the study of last things, is an important subject in theology. The doctrines of sin, redemption, and even subjects such as the presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper fall under the rubric of theology, even though they are not theology proper. With this basic orientation set by Aquinas, it would be good to hear something similar from the Protestant theologian Charles Hodge. Although the Protestant Reformation changed many things for the body of Christ, it did not greatly alter the basic definition of theology. Charles Hodge of Princeton, who lived from 1797 until 1879, defined theology this way in the opening chapter of his Systematic Theology. Theology is the science of the facts of divine revelation so far as those facts concern the nature of God and our relation to Him. Let's point out several dimensions of this definition of theology. First, Hodge's definition is very similar to Aquinas' definition, but we should note how he explicitly mentioned revelation. Theology deals with the facts of divine revelation. Now, of course, Aquinas sought to depend on the revelation of God as well, but Hodge's definition reveals a typical Protestant concern, namely an emphasis on the importance of God's revelation, especially the Bible, as the main resource for theology. Second, it's also important to notice that, like Aquinas, Hodge described theology as a science. He saw theology mainly as an academic discipline. In fact, Hodge actually used the methods of natural or physical science in his day as a model for theologians to follow. Listen to the way he put it in the opening page of his Systematic Theology. The Bible is no more a system of theology than nature is a system of chemistry or of mechanics. We find in nature the facts which the chemist or mechanical philosopher has to examine to ascertain the laws by which they are determined. So the Bible contains the truth which the theologian has to collect, authenticate, arrange, and exhibit in their internal relation to each other. For Hodge, the job of the theologian was to use the Bible as data and to research, test, and organize that data, much like a 19th century scientist would in other fields. Now, he also believed that the conclusions of the theologian should be applied to Christian living, but, like Aquinas, Hodge tended to leave application in the hands of ministers and pastors, limiting the actual work of formal theology largely to academicians and their students. In the third place, we see that Hodge also claimed that there were two main topics in theology. When doing theology, we primarily concern ourselves with the nature of God and our relation to Him. This division of theology is similar to Aquinas' definition, distinguishing between theology proper and theology in general.